everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of Dare to be Fearless. So, back in 2011, I started a fashion blog called A Life in the Fashion Lane. And the reason that I started that blog is because when I was 7, my dad was wrongfully convicted and put in prison, maximum security prison in Cranston, Rhode Island. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that story that I will talk about at the end of this episode separately from this particular interview. But I have a very special guest today here who is remarkable. And before I introduce Justin, I have 2 questions I want to ask anyone who's watching this. And my first one is, what would you do if someone, a roommate, dad, mom, grandparent, just didn't come home? Like just completely almost vanished one day. And my second question would be, who would your first phone call be? And I asked these 2 questions because of what happened to my dad and what I remember from that experience in 2007 to 2011 when he was released from prison on a plea bargain. And that experience has shaped my career. It's the reason I started a blog. But I also feel now, being on the board of the Innocence Project in London and having been and gone to so many fundraising events and seen so much of the work that Innocent Project does around the world, that it feels like my responsibility now to make more people aware of this, as it is truly, aside from my career, like my life passion to make people more aware and help with how corrupt the justice system is. So Justin Brooks here is a lawyer. He has freed 40 plus people from prison. He wrote an incredible book called You May Go to Prison, But You Might Be Innocent.
You might go to prison even though you're innocent.
Okay, very close. And you have just the most impressive resume. But I met you actually years ago when I was living in LA because of the San Diego Innocence Project. And now you work with Latin America as well and the Innocence Project over there. Mm-hmm. So I would love to kind of start, we'll do Innocence for Dummies at the beginning of this. I would love for you to start by explaining what happens when somebody wrongfully convicted goes to prison and how you decided to start embarking on this form of law.
Sure. Well, when I went to law school, I actually went to law school to be a corporate lawyer. I had my undergraduate degree in business. I'd done MBA classes, and I was going to be a corporate lawyer. And then my first year criminal law professor took us to a prison. And I started talking to some of the guys there, and they were asking me questions that I didn't know the answers to. And I then went back to the prison and with some answers, and I started teaching in a prison when I was in law school, and my whole kind of life plan changed. I went on to be a criminal defense attorney in Washington, D.C., and I started teaching law school. I taught at Georgetown Law School for a while, and then I moved to Michigan, and I was teaching law school there. And I read one day about a woman in prison on death row in Illinois who was sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And I thought, how can anyone be sentenced to death on a plea bargain? So I went out to death row and met with her. She'd been scheduled to be executed. And she told me she was innocent. So I was like, you're innocent? Like, why did you plea? And she said, my lawyer told me that was the best thing for me to do. And so I went back and told my class that story. I said, there's this woman on death row. She's 23 years old. She was 21 when she was arrested. And she says she's innocent. Who wants to help me out? 4 kids raised their hands. So I had them over to my house in East Lansing that night. We sat around the kitchen table. We went through the police reports. And that night for me, the Innocence Project was born. It was the idea of working with students on these kinds of cases. So there'd been an Innocence Project that had opened up in New York at that time. This was a few years after it opened. And so we worked on her case, and ultimately I was able to prove her innocent, get her off death row. And I decided this is what I wanted to spend my life doing. So I quit my tenured faculty position, and I moved to the belly of the beast, which is California, with the largest prison system in the United States and largest death row at that time in the world. And I started freeing people from prison along with my students.
And you were in the San Diego chapter when you first moved to LA?
Yeah, so there was no real chapter. They were all independent organizations. So I started the California Innocence Project. It was the only one on the West Coast when I started it. And then we kind of created this network. It started with just 5 or 6 of us who were doing this really in the world. And now we have 68 or 69 projects in the United States, including multiple in California. We've got 3 projects here in the UK, and I work with them as you do. And I started 35 innocence organizations in Latin America, from the Tijuana border all the way down to Chile, Santiago, Buenos Aires. And I work with all those projects, and I train lawyers down there on how to do this kind of work.
This episode will air before National Wrongful Conviction Day, which is, I believe, October 4th, which is a very important day. But I do also think it's a very interesting time to have you on because of Biden stepping down, and Kamala Harris is an ex-prosecutor. And now so many people hate prosecutors, right? I mean, so many people hate cops. People love cops. I mean, that's a whole other story. But I think point blank, if you asked me if I like cops, I would just say because of what happened to my dad, like the anxiety I have even behind the wheel of a car. And as you wrote in this book, right, like you have no idea that you can go to prison for doing something that someone thinks you did that you didn't actually do. So that moment when you met that young woman, what year was that?
1995.
And how did you know she was innocent? Like, was there a gut feeling? Because I could tell you, right? I just stole a candy bar, but like somebody forced me to do it. And you could be like, okay, but how do you know that somebody's innocent?
I didn't know she was innocent. What I knew was that a 21-year-old in the United States of America was sentenced to death without a trial. And I knew that her lawyer had laid down and done nothing for her, because it made absolutely no sense that you'd plead out and get the death penalty. I mean, it's called a plea bargain for a reason. You're supposed to get a bargain in return. So all I knew on that day was that this totally violated any sense of due process that I had. And maybe other things impacted me. I have reflected on that question actually a number of times as to why I got dragged into
Thank
this
God
world.
you did.
but part of it is my parents moved to Puerto Rico when I was 12 years old, and I went to a Puerto Rican high school. Marilyn's Puerto Rican. That probably impacted me. The fact that she was so young, the fact that she was a woman. There's a lot of things that probably emotionally impacted me, maybe differently. I mean, I try to be in touch with my own biases, but I think that might have played into it. But I didn't know she was innocent. And with many of my clients, I don't know that they're innocent until we look into it and find out. But everywhere I looked in that case, I found out the case was built on nothing. The first weekend I was working on it, I drove to where the shooting happened in Humboldt Park in Chicago, and I stood right where the one eyewitness said she saw the shooting, and it was impossible. The shooting happened in front of a bathroom in the middle of the park, and I couldn't even see the bathroom. And then when I measured it off, it was over 400 feet away, and it had been pitch black. It was at midnight. There were trees obscuring it. There was like a little churro van. And when I found her, I found out, surprise, surprise, the only eyewitness in the city of Chicago happened to be the girlfriend of the victim. And I don't know if she went to the police to fabricate her testimony or the other way around, but we now know that more than 36 wrongful convictions have occurred as a result of the one detective who pinned this crime on my client. I'm not so naive. I always say there's 2 naive positions. One is that everyone in prison is guilty. The other is that everyone in prison is innocent, right? It's like most people in prison are guilty. So the question is, what are we comfortable with? Like we need to accept the fact that the system does make mistakes. And her case was just so shocking in the lack of care that was given to this kid. And she was a young kid. And just no care given whatsoever to her. And I even as a grizzled defense attorney, and I've been for a number of years, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that happened in the United States, and it just changed my entire life.
And lawyers who work for innocence, in terms of your pay, like I would like you to kind of expand on how much of this is pro bono work, how much of this, like how do you pay your bills when you're a lawyer who's helping essentially people who, for the most part, my father included, could not afford the O.J. Simpson, Robert Kardashian kind of lawyer to get them exonerated, even if they were innocent. So Innocence steps in as an organization to almost act on that defense as if they were that larger, very professional lawyer instead of a public defender, correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been doing this work now for 30 years, and I've never charged any of my clients a single cent. So I've never been paid for any of this work. I drive a 27-year-old Jeep as well. So it doesn't pay well.
Hmm.
But I'm incredibly fortunate in that I've been a law professor for all that time. So I get a
Yeah.
salary as a law professor, and that's how I make my living. And this is my charitable work, I
Yeah.
guess, which has taken up most of my time for the last 30 years. But I'm lucky that I'm able to do the work. And then law students work for free.
Hmm.
We have amazing volunteers like yourself who get involved in these projects. And so, I go out and do fundraising for the projects to raise basic expenses like gas money to drive out to the prisons so I can get my students lunch at McDonald's, so I can pay for expert witnesses if we need them to come into court, things like that. But I've never taken a salary for any of this work.
It's just crazy, even when you say about, right, like law students being given McDonald's, like the fact that you almost, and for any nonprofit, right, have to beg for donations for things that are so serious. And
Mhm.
that's why I asked at the beginning of this episode is like, no one thought or would ever think that this would happen to them or a family member. Two cases in particular, when I went to a fundraiser that you did in San Diego, Brian Banks and Kimberly, what was her?
Long.
Long. And I mean, their stories, if you could briefly maybe explain what happened to both of them and the work that you guys did to get them out of prison.
Sure. Well, also I'd like to address, the first part of that comment because you're right. Nobody thinks it's going to happen to them. That's literally why I wrote my book. And
Hmm.
that's why my book is called You Might Go to Prison, Even Though You're Innocent. And my book goes through all the causes of wrongful conviction and how they impact regular people who never think they're going to get caught up in the system. And until they are, they've never even thought about that in their life. And to try get that empathy from people of trying to understand people's stories. Kimberly Long is a perfect example of that. She's a middle class white nurse living in Riverside who came home one day and found her boyfriend beaten to death. And when the police came, they did a really crappy job of investigating the crime scene. She had the unfortunate situation that she had an argument with him earlier in the night at a bar. And so she became the prime suspect, and she went to prison for 7 years as a result of that until we were able to prove using DNA and a whole lot of other stuff that she was factually innocent. And Brian Banks was convicted simply on a 15-year-old who lied. Brian was one of the best football players in the country. He was on his way to USC. Everyone said he was going to play in the pros. And for whatever reason, probably some form of jealousy, this 15-year-old girl, and Brian was 16, said that he raped her. And Brian ended up sitting in a juvenile detention facility for a year. And then his lawyer said, look, you're going to get 44 years to life if you go to trial. It's going to be your word against hers. If you take a deal, I think I can get you probation. And so he took the deal thinking he'd get probation, and he got 6 years in prison. After he gets out, this girl actually Facebook friend requests him and says, can we let bygones be bygones?
Verbatim, that's what she said.
Yeah, I'm sorry I made that stuff up about you raping me in high school. And we had her on video saying it. We ended up getting Brian exonerated. He actually lived with my family for a period of time. We got him a trainer, and he actually ended up playing in the NFL. He ended up playing for the Atlanta Falcons, and there's a movie about the story
And who
where
played you in the movie?
Greg Kinnear plays me, and
So cool.
Morgan Freeman is in the movie. It's on Netflix right now, actually, here in the UK. It's on Hulu in the United States. But it's an important story because it was, again, a story of a plea bargain and people have to understand that sometimes innocent people actually plea because that's the best case scenario for them.
I want to talk about plea bargains because that's what actually happened to my dad. And I think that's a fascinating point of these cases is how is it that you can be a convicted felon or not, right? And you can get less time by like saying you did something, even if you didn't do it, and vice versa. But before I get into that, I would love to know if you know any specific statistics. Because, like, for example, I mean, my dad is, well, originally from Massachusetts, but he's white. You know, I think a lot of people may think, oh, this is inner city people who maybe come from very low middle class income backgrounds, potentially are African American or et cetera, and are getting locked up. But this is not just happening to African American people in inner cities, correct?
No, it is not. Statistically, and that's chapter 10 of my book, is, you're poor and or a person of color. Statistically, poor people get wrongfully convicted at a higher rate. People with lesser education get wrongfully convicted oftentimes because they say things they probably shouldn't have, or they submit to authority a little bit more. So they get into confession situations and end up getting beaten into stories that aren't true. And people of color get convicted at a higher rate, but it can impact anybody. Bill Richards, another one of my clients, guy lives out in the suburbs, same thing as Kimberly, comes home, finds his wife dead. He gets wrongfully convicted. It impacts everybody, and that's why everybody needs to care about it before it's them. I mean, I so believe that people can randomly wrongfully be convicted that I literally have a plan for my first day in prison.
I don't mean to laugh, but literally, I actually have nightmares sometimes. And I don't know if it's because it's what happened to my dad, of like literally something similar happening to me. What's your plan?
So my plan is, and it's a good plan for a lawyer,
Yeah.
is I'm going to go out in the yard and I'm going to get all the shot callers together from the various gangs. And I'm going to say, look, I'm going to be your lawyer, your lawyer, your lawyer, and your lawyer. Keep these other dudes off me, and I'll be in the law library trying to get you guys out of here. Like, I literally have had that in my head. Plan number 1, trolley to Tijuana and walk across the border. Plan number 2, survive prison.
Direct from a lawyer.
You just can't. I've seen it too many times that it's like a lightning bolt coming out of the sky that you can't plan for. And it happens more than people want to believe. And you asked about statistics. One statistic that really shocks me is that we've walked 4% of the people who've been sentenced to death in the United States. We've walked them off death row after findings of innocence, including my client, Marilyn Malero. Now, if you think about that for a second, death penalty cases are the most serious cases that get the most scrutiny, the most media attention, the most lawyering. And we're not just making a mistake at a 4% level. Those are the lucky ones who were able to prove their innocence later on. But imagine if it's 4% of the prison population that's now in the millions are innocent. And we know it's actually higher than that. And that's not acceptable.
So death row is been taken out of a lot of states, correct? Like since my dad was convicted in 2007. Death row, I think, has been removed from many states, but there's 3 now, I think, that still
Oh, no, there's still 30 left that have it. It's complicated, too, because California has suspended the death penalty, but it could come back. And then there's a lot of states where they're still using it. They're sentencing people to death, but they're not executing them. But then there's states like Texas that are still, might do an execution a week. So in the Deep South, it is alive and well, and the death machine rolls on. Supreme Court refuses to do anything about it. I have no confidence this court or the next 20 years is going to do anything about it. And we're so out of whack with the rest of Western civilization. We're one of the only we're in a list of countries that's like Iran, Iraq, China, and us. It's not a great list to be on in terms of criminal justice systems.
But we're still living in a world, predominantly in America, right, where every time I listen to NPR News, which is for the most part, I would say at least 5 days of the week, abortion. Number 1, abortion. Yeah, we are completely overlooking massive problems like this. So the justice system in general, I'm curious, do you think it's corrupt?
Well, I mean, if you'd asked me that question 20 years ago, I probably would have said absolutely, and everybody's corrupt. I'm, an angry young defense attorney. Now I've kind of come to the conclusion that everything in life is the bell curve. Right? So whether you're talking about lawyers or doctors or anything, there's the few that are extraordinary. There's most of us that fall in the good to okay. And then there's the horrible and the miserable and the terrible. So if you're saying, is the whole system corrupt? I don't believe that it is. But I do believe that, like everything else in life, you have both the totally incompetent police officers, the totally incompetent prosecutors, the incompetent judges. And then you have this small number that are actually kind of evil to the point of they literally will set people up. And it's a small number, but a small number that can do a lot of damage to a lot of lives. And that's the example of the detective in Chicago who put my client in prison. I mean, this guy having 36 people of his cases that are reversed for being wrongful convictions.
Yeah.
That's intentional. That's not a mistake that's been made over and over again.
No, it's quite similar to what happened to my dad. I mean, in 24 hours, 2 false confessions, no recollection of it, was completely on the brink of, he was an undiagnosed diabetic at the time. But the whole story, he should have gone to a hospital. He shouldn't have been locked up. And it's hard to not, have a bias against those cops in that system. Personally, what do you think about the death penalty then?
Oh, all you have to do is work on one of these cases, and you're against the death penalty. And the way it is for me is I don't think about, do people deserve to die? There's people out there who do awful things, evil things. It's easy to have a knee-jerk reaction and
Yeah.
say that person doesn't deserve to live. For me, the question is, does our system deserve to kill? And for me, a system that makes mistakes at that level shouldn't have that kind of power. So it's too imperfect to even have the conversation. So there are moral issues about it, there are financial issues, but for me, it just comes down to the system's not good enough.
No.
I'm not comfortable enough with my government executing people when it makes that many mistakes. And we've walked, 200 people off death
Yeah.
row. That's not like one or two or three. It's like 200 people who we are actually able to prove their innocence. That's just not good enough.
There was a case in Connecticut, which was I don't know if you probably know of this case, but it was, and I'm originally from Connecticut, but the other side of where this happened. It was a Cheshire case, then it was a home invasion, and they killed, I think, the mom and the two daughters, and it wasn't a wrongful conviction case. However, one of them was sentenced to death,
Hmm.
and then I think Connecticut abolished the death penalty, and they ended up putting him back to life in prison. And I remember thinking, I mean, I was quite young at the time, but I remember thinking, in a personal manner, if that had happened to you and you thought the person who murdered your family, right, and
Hmm.
did it and was convicted of doing it was going to die, and then all of a sudden now they're allowed to live.
Hmm.
And I think the doctor actually was pretty level-headed about it, but that is an interesting case. So is that something that happens if you're put to death and then the state happens to abolish the death penalty, you then go to life in prison?
You typically get life without parole. But I'd love to talk about that for a second because I see politicians really messing up an answer to that question. So if the question to a politician is, if your loved one was murdered, would you want that person executed? I wish they would just be honest about it and say yes.
Yeah.
Like if my wife was murdered or my kids were murdered, I would want that person dead. But does that mean our government should operate like that? Should our government operate was the same way an emotional person whose loved one is killed? That's not how a government should operate. That's why they wouldn't put me on the jury. I
Yeah.
would be a little biased. So I wish people would just be honest and human about it. Because to me, that's not the question. The critical question is the system working well enough that we can put that kind of thing in effect? Because we've had too many people I walked Mike Hanline out of prison after 36 years in prison. If he'd received the death penalty, he would have been executed decades before I was able to prove his innocence. And so it can't be a part of our system. However much we feel like we want it, however emotional we are about it, we just can't have it
Yeah.
because it's not good. We're not good.
No.
We're not good enough.
I think that Kim Kardashian and Making a Murderer, and there's another organization as well called Reform. It's not just wrongful convictions. I feel like Innocence is really the only, correct me if I'm wrong, but the number one or only organization out there for this in particular, wrongful convictions.
Yeah, we've always
Okay.
tried to focus to keep, I think, not being just a general criminal justice organization, but focusing 100% on innocence. Some defense organizations, by the way, don't like that about us because they feel like, everybody's entitled
Yeah.
to good representation. And I feel that because that's what I used to do is I was just a regular criminal defense attorney. But I think the power of the innocence movement has been we get people to care about criminal justice reform, and it's hard to get people to care when the person's guilty. They just don't care what happens to guilty people, but they do care what happens to innocent people.
Yeah.
And that allows us to start looking at some of the processes like how are confessions obtained. Well, if everyone who confessed was guilty, no one would care. But if you can come in and say, hold on a second,
Yeah.
when you put someone in interrogation for 12, 13, 14 hours, and you use what's called the read technique, which all police use, which is focused on not getting the truth, but getting that person to agree to a narrative, we get innocent people who confess. And when people see that, they think, okay, well, then that should be reformed. And that's why I think it's been so powerful about our movement is we've got people to care.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of legislation. My office alone has been a part of 10 laws in California that now are the law. We changed the evidence standard. We created a right to DNA testing. We created a law for compensating people who are wrongfully convicted. We got identification reforms done. And all that was because we got people to care.
Someone might be listening to this and think, oh, and what I was going to say about Kim Kardashian Making a Murderer before I say this is that I feel like these people and these stories that have come out over the years, but mostly more recently, right, with the rise of social media, have made people more aware that for example, in Making a Murderer, right? The guy who was the face of that story. I mean, he was a bit of a quirky guy. He wasn't someone who you necessarily could have this easygoing conversation with. He might have been a bit socially awkward. And obviously, Kim Kardashian with Reform seems to work heavily on drug focused cases. But is there any common theme among the 40 plus people that you've helped get out of prison? Like, do you notice any, are there personality traits? Is there something there that made these people, aside from how they grew up, more susceptible to being incarcerated?
I, I think, in a way, the most common thing about them is what made them not necessarily susceptible to be incarcerated, but to survive incarceration. What's definitely a common thing in my clients is they're mentally tough, and they were the kind of people who could survive it, and they're the kind of people who never gave up. And then when they get out, they're the kind of people who can get their lives back together. A lot of people in prison just give up, innocent or not. They just give in to it, and a lot of them end up dying. And that's a thing that I've seen that's very common. In terms of the themes that get them there, that was the whole point of writing my book. Was, in fact, the original title of my book was Top 10 Reasons You Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent.
I like the other one more.
Yeah, my publisher didn't
Yeah.
like it either. They say it's too clickbaity. And I'm
It's
like,
too.
clickbaity's good.
Yeah.
But, so one of the chapters is called You Look Like Other People in the World. And I get into problems with identification. I talk about false confessions. I talk about the problems with rural policing and urban policing, to say like anybody could get caught up in it. So I don't know. They come from all walks of life. It impacts everybody. I just know some things will increase you statistically, like people of color get it at a higher rate, poor people at a higher rate. But I certainly see the common strength of my clients. And of the 40 people I've freed from prison, and this is over decades, none of them have gone back to prison.
No.
So they were people who had that kind of ability to, get out and get their lives back on track.
I just read a piece about Brittany Griner that she was interviewed for in the New York Times. And I mean, she was locked up in Russia. And there was a part in this article on her, and it said something about like, how did you get through it? And she said there's literally no other choice. You accept the cards that have been handed to you. And it's actually something, when I asked my dad, like, how do you get through maximum security prison knowing you're innocent? And he says something similar.
Mhm.
And when you say being mentally tough, I mean, I would assume though, when you're in that position, I mean, I guess you're saying though that people kind of give up, but most people, I mean, they would have to think that they'll be able to get the attention of an Innocence Project or something to get them out, right?
Yeah, hope is such a tricky thing. I spend a lot of time training about it with my students and with lawyers, because you want to give people enough hope to survive, but you don't want to give them so much hope that they think they're coming home anytime soon, because we never know how long these cases are going to take. But yeah, there is a mental toughness that I don't fully understand because I have not experienced it. But I can tell you, my client Brian Banks, because we spent so much time together, because he lived with my family, we talked about these issues a lot. And he used to say that, when he was first in prison, he was so angry and it was just eating him up. And he one night was just lying on his bunk and thinking, this is all in my head and nobody cares about it but me.
Yeah.
And all I'm doing is damaging myself. And none of us in this modern world have that sort of time and reflect in time. I mean, think about how much time do you actually sit quietly, no cell phone, no noise, no television, nothing, and you're just in total solitariness. And, he was locked down to solitary confinement for 60 days at one point. So you do a lot of reflecting, and you're going to go one way or another.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by giving. When I say they give up, they start getting into fights, they start
Yeah.
breaking stuff, they start getting in trouble, and then they get themselves in a situation they can't get out of. They get into, some kind of violence or something worse. So it's interesting to see how tough these people are mentally. It's an amazing group of people to be around. I've been lucky to have so many of them in my life.
What is the longest person that's been in prison that you've helped to get out? How many years were they in?
This is Mike Hanline, who did 36 years. He went to prison when he was, I think, 35 years old and came out when he was 71.
And you walked him out of the prison
Mhm.
that day.
Yeah.
What was that like?
It's actually the most watched video that I have on YouTube. It's called Man Eats Hamburger After 36 Years. And we just videoed him coming out. And then with every one of my clients, I say, I'll take you anywhere you want to eat, because it's like amazing having that first meal with them. And Mike said, well, I've been seeing these Carl's Jr. ads for years. Because usually it's always surf and turf. It's
Yeah.
always like
Okay.
lobster and
Be
steak.
nice, yeah.
And he said, I said, I can definitely take you to Carl's Jr. So I take him to Carl's Jr. and he sits there and eats a burger and we film it. And now it's got tens of millions of views
Wow.
on YouTube. And then I tweeted it to Carl's Jr., one of my staff attorneys did, and said, hey, how about hooking up my can line? And they sent back free food for a year from my can line, which wasn't great for his health, but it was a nice gesture. But yeah, 36 years. And you watch this video, and what's so powerful about it is you see that he has trouble ordering in the restaurant. He hasn't made choices in 36 years. He didn't know how to use the ice machine. And then I was sitting there thinking, oh, we didn't get our own sodas and ice back in the 70s. You know, he'd been in prison since 1977. And then, you know, he's an auto mechanic, but he looked at his first car, he popped the hood and he said, I don't understand any of this. He said, this is a computer, it's not a car. And so now he works on classic motorcycles and classic cars. But yeah, it's wild being around someone who'd been out of society for 36 years.
And how is he doing now?
He's doing okay. He definitely struggles with technology. They all struggle with technology. I mean, look, every time we get a new cell phone.
I struggle with it.
Yeah, we struggle for a day. Like, what is this weird foreign thing? Now, imagine you never saw a smartphone before. You've never been on the internet. You've never seen a computer. And they don't do that stuff with them in state prison.
No.
There's no internet access. There are flip phones that people smuggle in, but no one has a smartphone. And so every one of my clients struggles with technology.
So when you get, what is it, an inbound? Like, how do you get notified if there is this person sitting here and we think they may be innocent? What is that process? I mean, because at the beginning, right, when you would have those 4 students you said with that first young woman, and that was in the 90s, and now it's 2024. How does this work?
So when I first moved to California and opened the California Innocence Project, I was thinking exactly that. How am I going to get cases? And then the LA Times wrote an editorial saying, welcome Justin Brooks to California and this thing called the California Innocence Project. And the mail has not stopped since then. So at the California Innocence Project, we would receive anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 letters a year. And so it was almost all from people writing from prison. And then every case got investigated. There'd be a law student looking into it. We'd have
Thousands
lawyers,
of cases.
Thousands.
Even stemming from a letter.
I set up this sort of Ford assembly line process on how to do that many cases. And we'd have this lengthy questionnaire they'd fill out. I had 100 volunteer attorneys, 10 full-time attorneys, and 20 to 40 law students. And every day it was just going through cases, looking for the ones where we felt we could do something.
Have you ever received an inquiry from someone, gone and visited them, and then realized they were not innocent?
Sure. That happens too.
Oh, it does. Okay,
the reality is, you know, some people like to just throw the spaghetti against the wall and hope it sticks. And, you know, far more often, though, was I think this person's innocent. There's nothing we can do about it. That was every single day. I know that we need to prove innocence, so there has to be evidence that's going to establish that. So, for example, a self-defense claim, I'm not going to be able to prove that if the jury didn't believe it. I've only ever won one drug case, and that was a kid in Nicaragua. I've never won one in the United States, because there's only 2 elements to a drug case. Did you have drugs, and did you know you had drugs? And I can't tell you the number of cases I looked at where they were kids on a street corner in LA. They lived on that street. The police arrested everybody on the block. And who knows how many of those kids were actually selling drugs, because in California, you don't have to have the drugs on you to be charged with possession. They just have to be in your dominion and control. And so the kids would have some drugs over by a trash can. A few of them would be selling to people. Other kids just live there. They all get arrested. Those cases are unwinnable once the jury didn't believe them. And of course, the jury didn't believe them because they see 10 young black kids. They're all guilty. So that has actually been the most draining part of this work, the thing that's got me to, I got to a point I couldn't review cases anymore after 25 years of doing it. Like I started to realize I wasn't even hearing the presentations. And then I started doing some research on secondary trauma and realized that I was full.
Yeah.
And that's why I spend my time now training people more than actually doing direct casework.
And would you say that there's like slip-ups, like when you're training someone or when anyone can review these cases, in the sense of just a human basic error that could end up making somebody stay in prison instead of being taken on as an innocence case or being
Sure.
exonerated?
And we make mistakes ourselves too. I mean, everyone's human, and there might be a case that might have been winnable that we miss and think we can't prove it, but maybe there is a way to do it. I mean, there's no science to it.
No.
There's no, we're not human lie detectors. I did have two cases in 25 years where I was convinced the person was innocent, and I ran the DNA testing, and they came up as guilty.
And you trust that DNA all the time? Like,
Depending on
yeah.
whether it's properly gathered and not
Okay.
contaminated and all these things. I had one case where a guy it was brutal murders, and I really didn't believe he'd done them, and he came up on the crime scenes, and then he started accusing me of being part of the government of setting him up. And I really started to think, I think this guy, something clicked in his brain that these crimes were so bad that he didn't believe he'd done them.
Really?
Yeah, which I hadn't come across that sort of thing, but they were absolutely gruesome crimes, which I won't even go to the descriptions. They're that bad, and I've done hundreds of murder cases.
But he did commit those crimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I spent hours with him in San Quentin, and I did believe he was innocent. But eventually, we've never gone to court with a case where somebody's guilty, because the burden is so high of proof that we have to prove innocence that no one's freeing guilty people through these projects. No. That's just not realistic.
So I was going to ask you, what was I going to say? For anyone who's listening and may think this makes no sense, and I think Texas is actually quite a good state to use as an example because I lived there for 4 years.
Okay.
I saw so many problems in that system. And I will honestly say that people who live in the Midwest, who live in places like Texas, are obviously heavily Republican, very big gun advocates, et cetera, out there, which is not my place to judge. However, I will say the conversations I had with people in Texas in comparison to some more liberal places on topics like this, people say, like, why would a cop want someone to go to jail when, for example, that predator or that murderer is still out there free? So I would ask you that. Why would somebody, a police officer, want to lock somebody up who was innocent just to what? Fill a quota? Is it that simple?
I think it's pretty rare, first of all, that would happen. I think what more happens is they believe the person's guilty, and then they start framing what they think is a guilty person. So they're not trying to frame an innocent person. They think they're framing a guilty person. Like, there was a case that a friend of mine worked on in Illinois where 3 separate cops were involved. They all became convinced this guy was guilty, and they all put in different pieces of evidence. And so when the other cops saw the other evidence, they thought, oh, he must be guilty. And it ended up all 3 of these cops had actually created the evidence independently. And so I think the framing happens more with people, them thinking they're framing guilty people. But every once in a while, there is the crazy rogue cop. I mean, in California, we had the Rampart scandal in Los Angeles. It was maybe you were young when that happened because it was about 26 years ago. Where it ended up that an entire division of LAPD was operating as a gang. They had their own gang tattoo.
What?
They were selling drugs, buying drugs, selling weapons, setting people up. And the way it unfolded was this one police officer was on video stealing 7 pounds of cocaine from the evidence room. He then got busted. He turned on his partner, who turned on another guy, who turned on another guy. And before you knew it, we found out the entire division was all involved in criminal activity. So you do have that kind of crazy thing going on. But again, I don't think that represents the norm. I think the norm is they get tunnel vision and they have bias and they start thinking, this is the guy. I know this is the guy. And then they make the case happen. They either get the confession, or they use a snitch who's now making something up, or they do a bad ID procedure, or something that now is going to lead to this person, them having the evidence to convict the person they think did it. But it's as simple as that.
But these people who then you help exonerate, is there somebody who still did this crime?
Sometimes.
On the streets?
Sometimes. I mean, in the Brian Banks case, that girl was never raped. So that's an example they weren't. But Horace Roberts, for example, one of our cases, we not only got Horace out of prison, we gathered the evidence against the 3 people who did the murder. And now they're being tried now in Riverside County. So we've solved, I think, over 25 years, we solved 4 murder cases where we brought the real murderers to the attention of the courts. And sometimes the only way we can prove our client's innocent is to get the real bad guy. And so we're part of that too.
So my dad, when this happened, he signed two false confessions, like I said, and he went for 5 years by a plea bargain because too much damage had been done at the beginning of this particular case. Now, a plea bargain to me is something I would be very curious for you to explain upon because I still don't really understand. But it's either you go to trial, which if my dad had gone, he would have died in prison and gone away for life. But you can say that you committed this crime and get a reduced sentence. So my dad
Mhm.
got 5 years. What is that process?
Well, so it starts with the fact that the United States has the biggest prison system in the world. We incarcerate the highest percentage of our population. So we have more people in our criminal justice system than China.
Why?
The simplest answer is the war on drugs. That if you look over the last 30 years, we went from not having that big a prison population to having a massive one. I mean, China has 1 billion more people than us, and we have more people in prison. So it's become so large and so overcrowded that plea bargaining has become almost the entire system. Like 95, 96% of cases are bled out. Only about 4% of cases go to trial. So all that stuff you see on TV and movies with trials, there's hardly any trials happen anymore. And it's because by nature of it, the system can't handle those trials. There's not enough courts, there's not enough judges, there's not enough space, there's not enough jurors. So the pressure has been put on to make people plea. And the way the pressure has increased is because sentences have gone up so high that now when I got out of law school, when I was doing a plea bargain, I might have been looking at a case where my client's looking at a 8 to 10 and they're offering me a 5 to 6, something like that. Like they're going to cut a few years off. It wasn't like the Brian Banks case where they say you might get probation if you take a deal. You get 44 years to life. So it's like literally a casino. Door number one, you might go home. Door number two, you're dying in prison.
Yeah.
And that they've had to increase those pressures to increase the number of plea bargains. And everybody's complicit in it. The whole system is complicit in this, of making us into a system of pleas. And that's the way it works. There's nothing complex to even understand. It's just like negotiating any other deal in your life. Buying a car, buying a house. You're buying how much time you're going to go to prison and how much risk you're willing to take by going to trial and rolling the dice. And that's what it comes down to. It's
And
that simple.
yeah, I mean, how do you even decide like whether or not to take that risk? I mean, do many of your clients take that risk and go to prison? I mean, go to trial?
Very few people that go to trial
Yeah.
anymore, period. We even have the problem now in post conviction of plea bargaining because some of the prosecutors in California figured out, well, even if they exonerate them, we can still recharge them with the crime. So I'll give you an example. Guy Miles, our client, was convicted of robbing a bank in Orange County. He'd never been to Orange County. He was in Las Vegas at the time of the crime. We went in, we proved these other 3 guys did it. We got him exonerated. We had him ordered released from prison. Well, the Orange County District Attorney's Office said, we're going to prosecute him again. And it's like, well, you guys have no evidence. We'll see. And then they set a $2 million bond on him. So I had to go sit in a jail cell with him and say, look, I think we're going to win this retrial. You've already been in prison 20 years. But I've got bad news for you. You have a $2 million bail. They say they're going forward with a new trial, even
Oh
though
my God.
they're going to lose. But minimum, you're going to be sitting here for another year. Or they just offered me you can walk out of here today and take a plea.
And what would that plea do?
He has a criminal record.
Okay.
And then he said to me the most heartbreaking thing. He said, I've thought about doing that, but I feel like I was letting you down. And I was like, this isn't about me.
Yeah.
It's about the rest of your life. I'm like, I would take this deal.
The
And
plea.
he
Yeah.
took it. And we walked him out.
Yeah.
But it's just terrible. Like it's one of those things like they always win if they don't play fair.
But
And they have all the power.
it's so hard to listen to like a lawyer in your level of expertise, even when you say like the Orange County that they would just say, we'll see. Why would they want this person? It's like, is it personal? Are they racist? Like, what? It doesn't make any sense.
Could be any of those things. And I think it's, again, though, giving the benefit of the doubt, they think they're right. They think they're right. They've got tunnel vision. They
Yeah.
convince themselves. And that's the problem with human nature. Sometimes we can't see things right in front of us because of our own inherent biases. I try to think about that all the time with my own decision making, is like, because we all are biased. In fact, bias is one of the most misunderstood things. I always say you can't open a door without bias because bias is prior experience informing your present action. So every time you open a doorknob, that's based on your prior experience opening doorknobs, how much pressure you're going to put on it. Are you going to turn it to the right or turn it to the left? All day long, we couldn't function as humans without bias.
No.
When bias becomes prejudice is the problem. And when bias leads us down these bad paths where we're making mistakes and making errors in judgment. And I just think we're all biased. And I think prosecutors get into their bias, defense attorneys, of course, get in their bias, police get in their bias. And we got to try to pull ourselves back as best we can.
When you've helped get anyone out of prison, do you ever then have a conversation with, say, the judge who convicted the person or any of the other side who helped set up this situation in the worst way? Or do they just go on and say, oh, sucks that they spent 40 years in jail for something they didn't do. On to the next case.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, I have had DAs apologize, particularly the current DA of Los Angeles. He's been great. We've freed a number of people with him, and he apologizes to them, meets with them privately in his office with their family, doesn't object to getting declarations of innocence that assist them in getting compensation. So I think some of the smarter, more savvy DAs and the ones that also have a heart take that path. And then there's, Orange County.
Yeah,
and
ruthless.
then there's San Bernardino County. And then there's all the desert counties. So, it's kind of like, what Led Zeppelin said in Stairway to Heaven. There's two paths you can go by. And the path number one is to fight us to the bitter end. And the path number two is to cooperate and do the right thing. And then we'll all sing Kumbaya and go home. And that's what it should be. Yeah. But it's not always that.
That's what I always say. I mean, even obviously not myself being locked up, but that kind of trauma is like I could have gone down such a negative path, but I was able to spin it into this career. So everyone truly does have two paths. Now, my second to last question for you is, in particular, what do you think needs to be changed? I mean, if you could choose 3 things that need to be changed right now.
Okay. Well, they're all laid out in my book. Again, You Might Go to Prison
Which
Even Though You're
in
Innocent.
The show notes,
available at Amazon.com.
Yeah.
But each chapter, I don't want to just talk about the problems. I do want to talk about solutions. Yeah. It was important to me. So, for instance, identifications. It is so easy for us to improve identifications and how they're done. You can't have police officers in the room who know who the suspect is because they're terrible poker players. Just something as simple as that, making the procedure double blind, like all good science is, would decrease the number of wrongful convictions and get more bad guys. Yeah. Everyone should be on board with that. We still have police departments where they say they don't have the facility to record confessions. They don't have the capacity. Everyone on the planet is walking around with a sophisticated recording device in their pocket, known as a cell phone. And these guys are still saying they can't record confessions. And if we recorded them, we'd know exactly what happened in that situation. And if they're offering them coffee and tea and they're saying, I killed my wife, okay, good. But if we see that 12, 13 hours of coercive questioning where they're putting in someone's head, someone who may have been blackout drunk the night of the incident, then we know they've created a confession. So that's just a simple reform that we could do. More broadly, we need more training. We need the police being trained more. We need better juries. We need to have standards for forensic science. We've got a lot that aren't even really sciences that we're allowing into court, like forensic odontology, bite mark science. It's a bunch of bored dentists with too much time on their hands who love CSI. It's not a science. It's total garbage. Yeah. And yet dozens of people have gone to prison based on bite marks. I could literally tell you the reforms all day long. There's no way for me to narrow it down to 3.
But if you read the book.
There's so many problems. And so many of them could be fixed without money, without cost, and would also help us get more bad guys. And that's why I think what's been great about the innocence movement is we haven't been political. In fact, in California, we have more Republican support than Democratic support from the legislature because they see that we're kind of part of the law and order movement because there's an order part of that. And order means get the right people. And so it's not political. It shouldn't be politicized. Everyone should be on board with it. And that's why these reforms should be easy to pass, but they're not. They're a struggle because you got to get people's attention, and it takes time and effort and thought.
So, how do we get to that where all of these things that you just mentioned, along with many others, are fixed or resolved, where this isn't happening?
Yeah, people got to get in touch with their legislatures at the state level. In the United States, it's most important. Here in Britain, where you can get national policies changed, which has always been an exciting thing for me in other countries. That in the U.S. we got to fight 50
Yeah.
jurisdictions to get anything countrywide. In fact, actually, in the United States, everything happens at the county level. So you can't even just change a state; you got to change a county. Um, and so people, yeah, got to get involved in those processes, and they got to care about the issue before they're the one who gets
Yeah.
locked up or their family member, because people are actually less interested in hearing from those people. But when somebody comes in who's like, I don't have any dog in this fight here, but this is wrong the way this is being done, you can maybe get some support for that.
There's so many stages as well, to somebody being locked up. And something in particular you mentioned with your client who, the Carl's Jr., and then the other one who took the plea after instead of spending a year. Now, for example, I mean, when my dad got out on a plea, right? You go from being potentially somebody who had a solid, stable job to a parole officer being like, if it's a sexual predator or rape case, etc., you can't be within near X amount of feet from kids. You're at a halfway house. There's no help. You get out of jail if you didn't commit this crime on a plea bargain. There's no money. There's no funding. There is sometimes money, but for a lot of people, I assume they don't get anything from the state. And
Mm-hmm.
you're expected to now live with a criminal record and essentially go from, if you're a college educated person, to now you can't even get a job at McDonald's.
Right.
What does that even mean for us as a society?
I mean, that's where we shoot ourselves in the foot. Like, because we're so vengeful of like prison should be punishment every day. And then when people get out, figure it out
But
yourself.
how can you?
And that's why we end up having the highest recidivism rate in the world. Like, we wouldn't have such a huge prison population if people didn't keep coming back in. And a lot of people come back in not for committing new crimes, but for probation violations,
Hmm.
parole violations, and or not being employed for a period of time. I had a client once, to show you how stupid the system is. He got busted with cocaine in DC. He'd never been in DC before that weekend. He lived in North Carolina. He goes to prison. He gets out on parole. I try to get DC to move his parole to North Carolina, where he has a wife, a child, a house, and a job with an ambulance company. They refuse to do it. A couple of years later, he's on parole. His daughter gets very sick. He drives down to see her because he's worried that she's dying. Some jerk finds out about it, calls his parole officer, goes back to prison for 6 years for leaving the District of Columbia. That's the kind of thing that just hurts everybody. Like, taxpayers, you're paying now $65,000 a year for that person to be in prison. His family's going to be on social services, so you're going to pay for that.
Hmm.
And for what? What do we get out of that? And yet, if we approached like Northern Europe does, of corrections being about correcting people, their philosophy is you're sentenced to 10 years in prison, and we're going to spend those 10 years trying to make you into a better person, better educated, better fit for working, so that when you get out of here, you can function in society. We don't think like that. We think, let's punish you while you're in
Yeah.
prison. Let's take away educational programs. Let's take away job prep programs. And when you get out, we'll assign you a parole officer that's going to ride you and not necessarily help you. But if you step out of line, make sure you go back to prison.
Yeah.
It hurts everybody when we think like that.
And it's wild because it's not like, you could go back for essentially doing something that's totally opposite to that crime based on. I mean, I can't even imagine if you're having to almost bow down. You have freedom, but it's actually when you get out, do you really have freedom if you're attached to a parole officer?
Some people shouldn't even be on parole because they know they're not going to be able to fulfill all the
Yeah.
obligations of it. They might say you have to stay away from this area, you can't go to bars, you can't this, you can't that, and then they end up violating and coming right back into the system. And we keep making this mistake over and over and over and over again. And in this election cycle, once again, when I hear the conversation around criminal justice, it's like more police, lock more people up, harsher sentences. It's the same rhetoric that has failed over and over and
Yeah.
over again.
Yeah, and I think we could both agree it doesn't mean that people who didn't do terrible things shouldn't go to prison.
Absolutely.
But there's so many things that should be adjusted, right? So that people who go to prison are meant to be there and the
Hmm.
people who don't deserve to be there aren't there.
And then there's these people, I worked in a prison for 3 years, and there were definitely people who needed to be there forever. I mean, there were people
Yeah.
that were super violent, had to be taken out of society, but the overwhelming majority of people in prison don't fit that
No.
category. Most of the people are in for drug offenses. And so you can deal with drug offenses because that's either an economic issue or a health issue.
Yeah.
It's either you're an addict or you're a dealer or maybe both. And so that can be dealt with. That's not like a sociopath that's going out killing people randomly. So we have to stop thinking about people who are incarcerated that way.
Yeah.
And the difficulty with that is prisons are designed for us not to see that. They're hidden away. They're usually in the middle of nowhere. Most people, unless you had a family member who's incarcerated like you have no sense of who's locked up in a prison
No.
because you only see the horror stories on TV and you think, oh, there must be a million dudes like that when there's really like 1,000.
Yeah.
And this is, it continues to perpetuate itself.
Justin, you are incredible. I can't thank you and applaud you from a personal standpoint, but also just from society of the work that you have done and continue to do. Do you see this as being the rest of your life?
Yeah, I don't. I think what I did, I went and walked the Camino. Do you know the Camino Santiago Compostela?
No.
So the Camino is a 500-mile walk across Spain,
Okay.
which I've done now a couple
Wow.
times. It's a place I like to go and contemplate.
Casual. That's a lot
So
of contemplating,
it's
but
30
okay.
days, 30 days
That's
straight
a lot
of walking.
Do you eat?
And
Yeah,
you
okay.
eat and sleep. It's
Okay.
actually beautiful. It's a
That's
fantastic
okay.
walk. I walked across California once too, but that's a whole
Mhm.
other story. But I realized a couple of years ago that the best use of whatever time I have left is not necessarily to do direct case work, but to try get these messages out, which is why I'm so happy to talk to you
Yeah.
today, to write books about it, to train lawyers how to do it, and to build projects and build capacity in them, because that's a bigger legacy. And then very few people work in Latin America on this topic at all. And I'm fortunate that I speak Spanish and I live on the border.
Incredible.
And so I'm able to do all the same kind of work and give speeches down in Mexico and Central America and South America. So I do a lot of TV down there, radio. Last time I was in Mexico, they actually had 6 billboards on the highway with my face on them as I left the
Wow.
airport, which I said, this is very nice, but I like to be much more low key when
Low-key.
I'm in Mexico. I'm not looking to get kidnapped down here. So a billboard would
Oh, yeah,
be,
it's
maybe
kinda
take the
scary.
billboards
Yeah.
down. But yeah, it's great work to be able to use what I've actually learned from in the trenches doing
Yeah.
this work and talk to people about it.
Where can everyone find you on social media? Plug the book again. Of course, I will put this all in the show notes as well. But
Sure, I'm on Twitter or X, I guess it is.
Yep.
I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram at Justin O. Brooks, which was my name all through high school. Justine O. Brooks is
Love
actually Justin O. Brooks. And yeah, my book, You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent, is available wherever books are sold, which seems to be mostly Amazon.com.
Yes. I love a good actual book, though. You know, like going into a Barnes and Noble
I
and like
know.
the
Me
smell and a library. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just
No, I love
old.
books too.
Me
It's
too.
sad. I used to spend a lot of time in
Yep,
bookstores.
same. Well, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. I will link all of his social media as well as Innocence Project in the show notes. And as I mentioned earlier in the episode, National Wrongful Conviction Day is October 4th. So there are tons of more intricate fundraisers surrounding that day. So if you have money and no idea what to do with it and you need a purpose, I've given you a purpose in this episode. And I truly hope you will check out the work that Innocence as well as Justin does. Head to the show notes to follow more Dare to Be Fearless content. And I'll see you guys next week for a new episode of the show.